"You think you can laugh at me and get away with it." The words whispered through Derek Collins' mind as he stepped into the towering doors of the Richmond District Courthouse, the early morning sun striking the marble facade with a golden glare that made the columns gleam like sentinels watching over the city. The hallway stretched ahead, long and echoing, the polished wooden floors reflecting the sterile light from the overhead fixtures, the faint scent of old coffee and paper lingering in the air as court staff shuffled through stacks of files and papers, their shoes clicking sharply against the floor. Derek adjusted his tailored navy suit, the fabric crisp against his shoulders, and felt the familiar weight of authority settle around him like a cloak he had worn countless times before, yet today it felt heavier, charged with anticipation. The gallery was beginning to fill, spectators murmuring quietly among themselves, their eyes flicking toward the row of officers stationed at the back, their expressions a mix of boredom and smugness, oblivious to the power quietly occupying the defendant's side of the room. Derek's gaze swept the courtroom, taking in the towering judge, the polished gavel resting lightly in his hand, the stifled whispers of the jury, the subtle shuffling of papers, and the occasional cough from someone trying to disguise impatience or nervousness. Every detail was catalogued in his mind, each glance, each posture, each subtle twitch of a shoulder or tilt of a head feeding the pattern he had observed, memorized, and anticipated. He paused just before stepping onto the polished floor, letting his eyes meet those of Officer John Matthews, who lounged with casual arrogance near the witness stand, smirking, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as if challenging Derek to assert himself. Matthews had no idea who Derek truly was, assuming the confident poise and calm demeanor were simply the front of an ordinary defendant, and that assumption alone made him reckless, careless, and loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. Derek allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, measured, almost imperceptible, a hint that there was more beneath the surface, a quiet promise that the room was about to be reminded of a truth they had long ignored. He walked with steady steps, each footfall deliberate, the subtle creak of the polished floor under his shoes marking a rhythm that contrasted with the hurried, scattered movements of others in the room, drawing a quiet, almost imperceptible tension into the air that prickled the skin without anyone noticing immediately. As he approached the center, the murmurs in the gallery seemed to hush, the officers shifting slightly in their seats, sensing that something was different, though none could articulate what. Derek's eyes remained fixed on Matthews, calm yet piercing, and in that moment, the room itself seemed to pause, suspended between expectation and revelation, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows casting long shadows that stretched across the room like the fingers of fate itself, reaching to touch each person present with the quiet inevitability of consequences yet to unfold. Each movement, each subtle breath, each glance exchanged held weight, carrying the unspoken power of preparation, experience, and authority, and while Matthews chuckled quietly to himself, convinced of his own superiority, Derek's presence alone began to command a shift, a subtle rearrangement of perception that would, within moments, ripple through every mind in the courtroom, silent but undeniable. The gavel's occasional tap punctuated the charged air, a metronome counting down the seconds until understanding, until realization, and Derek, unflinching, poised and assured, waited, letting the room set itself, letting the arrogance and underestimation of those around him build to a crescendo that only he knew would soon break into an irrevocable revelation. The courtroom air was heavy with anticipation, the faint hum of the overhead lights blending with the distant shuffle of papers and the soft footsteps of the clerks moving between desks. Derek Collins settled into the defendant's chair, his posture impeccable, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on the polished surface in front of him. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of spectators, the silent exchange of glances among the officers, and the subtle shifts in the jury members' positions. Each detail was observed with precision, from the slight twitch of a hand to the way sunlight glanced off the gold trim of the judge's gavel. Matthews, leaning casually against the edge of the witness stand, shifted uncomfortably under Derek's calm gaze, a faint furrow appearing on his brow, almost imperceptible, yet enough to betray the first ripple of unease. The gallery remained hushed, whispers dying in midair as the tension thickened, like the slow gathering of a storm that had yet to break, the polished wooden floors reflecting the light, in long lines that drew the eyes toward the center of the room. Derek adjusted his tie slightly, not out of nervousness, but as a deliberate gesture, one that subtly commanded attention and suggested a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with Matthew's restless movements. The judge cleared his throat softly, his gavel resting idle for the moment, as if sensing the undercurrent of anticipation in the room, the faint click of the doors opening and closing behind the spectators punctuating the rhythm of the tension. Derek's mind moved methodically, tracing the invisible lines of influence, power, and authority in the courtroom, noting how every person present occupied their space, unaware that the subtle gravity of his presence was already altering their perception. Matthews shifted again, attempting to maintain his composure, yet his movements were slightly sharper, more pronounced, betraying the awareness of a growing imbalance, the quiet realization that the calm man sitting opposite him might not be as ordinary as he had assumed. Outside the courtroom, the sun climbed higher, casting slanted rays through the tall windows, illuminating specks of dust that floated like tiny particles of time suspended in the still air. Derek allowed his eyes to wander briefly to the jury, noting the way several members straightened in their seats, an almost subconscious reaction to the poised figure before them, their previous assumptions unspoken but already challenged by the subtle authority he exuded. Each breath he took was measured, a silent cadence that contrasted with the barely contained energy in Matthew's posture, the slight tapping of a foot, the shifting of weight from one leg to another, the small gestures amplifying the tension as Derek remained entirely composed. The spectators felt it too, a quiet shift, a weight settling over the room that made ordinary movements deliberate, pauses longer, eyes more attentive. Derek did not rush. He allowed each moment to stretch, building the anticipation with silence as much as presence, letting the room itself become part of the narrative, each observer unknowingly participating in the orchestration of perception. Matthews glanced around, seeking confirmation from his fellow officers, but their eyes avoided his, the subtle signs of doubt beginning to creep into the space he had assumed was secure. Derek's gaze, calm and unwavering, met Matthews once again, a silent acknowledgement of the power imbalance yet to be revealed, and the courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable unfolding of events that would challenge every assumption, every expectation, every preconception held by those who had entered thinking they understood the shape of authority and control. The murmurs in the courtroom grew softer, each spectator now acutely aware of the tension in the space, the slight tightening of the chest, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other, the way the light from the tall windows caught the edges of faces and polished wood, casting long, thoughtful shadows that seemed to linger and stretch with unspoken anticipation. Derek Collins remained poised, hands lightly clasped on the table, eyes scanning the room with measured precision, noting every twitch, every glance, every almost imperceptible movement. Officer John Matthews shifted uneasily again, attempting a forced smile, a laugh to cover the growing awareness that the situation was no longer under his control, the faint furrow of his brow betraying a flicker of doubt that had not been there when he first entered the room. Derek allowed his gaze to sweep past the officers and jury, taking in the subtle interactions, the way a hand rested briefly on the edge of a desk, the quiet exchange of glances between spectators, the barely audible whisper of a pen scratching across a notepad. Each detail fed into the calm calculation of his mind, every motion, every pause, a thread in the delicate weave of perception he had already begun to shape. The judge, seated with a composed posture behind the elevated bench, allowed the courtroom to settle into silence, tapping the gavel lightly in a rhythm that did not demand attention, but instead subtly signaled readiness, the polished oak gleaming under the morning light. Derek noticed the faint creak of the hinges on the courtroom doors, the soft hum of air conditioning, the distant murmur of a clock in the corner marking the passage of each deliberate second. Matthew's gaze flicked briefly toward the jury, seeking reassurance, a subtle cue that might signal dominance, but found only the stillness of attentive eyes and an unspoken, yet perceptible, shift in demeanor. Derek shifted slightly in his seat, a motion so minimal that it might have gone unnoticed. Yet in that movement there was authority, a silent assertion of presence, a controlled cadence that contrasted sharply with the restless energy Matthews now exhibited. The air seemed to thicken around them, not with sound, but with the weight of observation and expectation, the quiet awareness that the ordinary flow of proceedings was being challenged by an unseen, yet undeniable, power. Each breath Derek took was steady, controlled, filling the space with a subtle rhythm, a pulse that seemed to harmonize with the quiet ticking of the courtroom clock, with the faint shuffle of papers, with the soft footfalls of the staff moving between the desks. The gallery, once filled with the casual murmurs of expectation, now seemed to lean forward imperceptibly, drawn by the gravity of composure, the subtle signals of control, the quiet yet firm presence of a man who carried authority not with loud declarations, but with measured, intentional, and deliberate calm. Matthew's shoulders tensed, the faint tightening of his jaw, the brief glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes, betraying the first real acknowledgement that the equilibrium had shifted, that the assumptions he relied upon were no longer sufficient, that the narrative of dominance he believed he commanded was quietly being rewritten by the quiet, steady force sitting opposite him. Derek's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, steady, unwavering, and in that gaze there was a silent, undeniable assertion that control, authority, and respect were not simply assumed but earned, observed, and recognized, and that the courtroom, every witness, every juror, every officer present, would now witness the unfolding of a presence that demanded acknowledgement without a single word raised in conflict, a power that was quiet, measured, and utterly unshakable. The soft murmur of voices in the courtroom faded almost entirely, replaced by a quiet, almost palpable anticipation that seemed to pulse through the polished wooden benches and echo subtly off the high ceilings. Derek Collins remained seated, his posture flawless, shoulders relaxed but commanding, fingers lightly tracing the edge of the table as his gaze swept the room with unwavering precision. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows illuminated the room in shifting patterns, casting long, deliberate lines across the jury, the officers, and the spectators, making the space feel suspended in a moment of heightened awareness. Matthews shifted in his chair, a slight unease flickering across his expression as he attempted to maintain an air of control, glancing toward the judge and then back at Derek, as if seeking reassurance that the situation had not yet spiraled beyond his expectations. Every subtle movement was catalogued. In Derek's mind, from the gentle adjustment of a tie by a juror to the nearly imperceptible tapping of a pen against a legal pad, each micro-expression and motion contributing to the intricate tapestry of attention and perception he was weaving. The gallery seemed to lean forward, unconsciously drawn to the stillness and quiet authority radiating from Derek, a presence that commanded attention without a word spoken, each breath measured, deliberate, the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation almost synchronizing with the subdued tick of the wall clock and the faint shuffle of papers in the clerk's hands. Matthew's confidence wavered subtly, a tightening of the jaw, a brief glance that lingered too long on Derek's calm, deliberate gaze, the first acknowledgement that the man before him was no ordinary defendant, that the equilibrium he had assumed was shifting imperceptibly, but irrevocably. Derek's eyes moved with quiet deliberation, observing the officer's posture, noting the faint shift of weight, the minor gestures of hesitation, and the subtle, almost instinctive recalibration of attention that began to spread from Matthews to those seated around him, the jury leaning in slightly, the spectators adjusting their focus, the air thickening with expectation as if the walls themselves held their breath. Each second stretched, deliberately, unhurried, as Derek allowed the room to settle into this rhythm of attentive stillness, letting every eye, every slight movement, every unspoken thought gather into a collective awareness of something significant poised to unfold. The judge's hand rested lightly on the gavel, an unspoken signal of readiness. The room's atmosphere charged not with action but with quiet, anticipatory tension, every individual present sensing the subtle, building energy without yet comprehending its source. Matthew's shoulders tensed further, the faint flicker of doubt growing into a quiet apprehension, a recognition that the narrative of authority he had assumed was quietly, almost imperceptibly, being restructured by the composed, deliberate, and entirely controlled presence sitting across from him. Derek allowed a slow, measured blink, a slight adjustment of his hands, a minimal shift of his body that conveyed confidence and control, his aura of calm authority subtly asserting itself into the consciousness of every person present. The courtroom suspended in a balance of perception and anticipation, the space itself seemingly bending around the quiet, undeniable power of his presence. The subtle tension in the courtroom seemed to thicken with each passing moment, as if the air itself was attuned to the quiet authority emanating from Derek Collins. He allowed his gaze to sweep the room once more, noting the small, almost imperceptible cues of anticipation and unease in the spectators, the jurors, and the officers alike. Matthew's usual composure had begun to fray at the edges, the faint tightening of his hands on the edge of the stand betraying a growing recognition that the ordinary assumptions of dominance were no longer reliable. Derek's movements remained deliberate yet unassuming, a slight shift of his chair, the gentle adjustment of his tie, a calm and measured blink, each gesture conveying a quiet command that subtly reshaped the perception of everyone present. The polished floor reflected the long beams of sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting shifting patterns across the room, and Derek allowed the interplay of light and shadow to accentuate his presence without drawing overt attention, the environment itself seeming to acknowledge the weight of poised authority he carried. The spectators leaned forward ever so slightly, drawn by the composure and confidence that radiated from him. The way he held himself suggesting a depth of experience and a history of command that contrasted sharply with Matthew's increasingly obvious discomfort. Every small noise, the shuffle of papers, the muted cough of a juror, the gentle tapping of a pen, was absorbed into the deliberate rhythm Derek maintained, his awareness encompassing the entire space and every individual within it. Matthews attempted a subtle shift in posture, a small adjustment meant to reassert control, yet it only underscored the contrast between his tension and Derek's controlled calm, the quiet gravity of presence beginning to assert itself over assumptions and preconceptions. Derek allowed his eyes to linger on the jury members, noting the subtle straightening of backs, the attentive angle of heads, and the slight pause in murmured conversation, all unconscious acknowledgments of the authority quietly but unmistakably projected from where he sat. The judge, aware of the shift in energy, rested his hands lightly on the gavel, the polished surface gleaming in the sunlight, his silent observance contributing to the room's charged atmosphere without any direct intervention. Each person present was drawn into the web of perception Derek had constructed, every glance, every small movement, every unspoken thought subtly reshaped by the quiet confidence and measured poise that defined his presence. Matthew's eyes flickered nervously, searching for support or reassurance from the other officers, but found only mirrored uncertainty, the subtle acknowledgement that the balance of expectation had begun to tilt. Derek's measured breathing, calm and deliberate, seemed to harmonize with the room, each exhalation reinforcing the subtle rhythm of control he maintained, a quiet insistence that respect and authority were not assumed but recognized, observed, and felt. The sunlight continued to shift across the courtroom, casting long, deliberate shadows that highlighted the unspoken tension and quiet anticipation, every eye, every motion, every pause building toward the inevitable revelation that authority could manifest in ways far beyond the superficial trappings of uniform or position. That quiet presence and measured composure alone could command recognition, unsettle assumptions, and reshape the perception of power in a room that had thought it understood its hierarchy. The quiet hum of the courtroom seemed to settle into a rhythm, the soft creak of the polished floors beneath shoes, the occasional scratch of a pen on paper, and the distant echo of murmured conversation blending into the charged stillness that filled the space. Derek Collins remained seated with impeccable poise, the slight shift of his hands along the table, and the measured inhale and exhale of his breath projecting a calm that belied the intensity of attention surrounding him. Matthews shifted subtly, a frown forming as he realized that the casual arrogance he had carried into the room was being met with a presence far more deliberate and commanding than he had anticipated. Derek's gaze moved slowly, scanning each person in the gallery, noting the subtle adjustments in posture, the slight lean forward of a juror, the careful alignment of a spectator's hands, and the minor movements of the officers as they unconsciously recalibrated their assumptions. Every detail, from the reflection of light on the polished wood to the angle of a chair leg and the faint rustle of clothing, was absorbed into Derek's awareness, feeding into the unspoken narrative he had begun to construct. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast long, deliberate shadows across the room, tracing over the polished surfaces and the attentive faces, creating a visual rhythm that mirrored the quiet cadence of anticipation Derek maintained in his presence. Matthew's attempt at maintaining composure faltered slightly, a subtle hitch in his stance, a micro-expression of doubt that Derek noted without comment, his calm demeanor amplifying the growing sense of recognition among the officers and spectators that something significant was quietly shifting in the dynamics of authority within the room. The judge, seated with steady composure, allowed the natural flow of the environment to unfold, his hands resting lightly on the gavel, as if marking the passage of time, while silently acknowledging the subtle tension building between the parties present. Derek's movements remained minimal yet deliberate, a slight adjustment of his posture, a small turn of the head, each gesture reinforcing the perception of authority and control, each measured action a silent communication to the room that calm, deliberate presence could command respect and attention more effectively than overt assertion. The gallery continued to absorb the quiet tension, spectators' eyes following the subtle signals of power, the unconscious alignment of attention drawn to Derek's measured poise, his awareness threading through the room like a quiet undercurrent that touched every individual without a word spoken. Matthew's attempts at small gestures to reclaim authority were muted against the unshakable composure he faced, the subtle contrast amplifying the realization that assumptions of dominance based on position, uniform, or prior expectations were now quietly being challenged by presence and command rooted in experience, preparation, and understated authority. Derek allowed a calm blink, a brief shift in seating that communicated attentiveness and control simultaneously, drawing the room deeper into a shared, almost subconscious recognition of order, respect, and measured power. The faint sounds of the courtroom, the soft shuffle of papers, the occasional cough, the subtle echo of movement, were absorbed into the rhythm Derek maintained, each element accentuating the quiet influence he projected over the space. The sunlight continued its slow crawl across the room, highlighting the attentive postures of the jury, the subtle adjustment of the officers, and the anticipation in the spectators' eyes, each shadow and line reinforcing the growing awareness that the balance of perception and authority was being carefully, deliberately, and inevitably restructured by the calm, measured presence of the man at the center, whose quiet mastery of attention and environment had begun to dictate the tempo and focus of every individual in the room without a single word raised. The moment shifted almost imperceptibly, the subtle weight of anticipation giving way to a quiet tension that seemed to hold the entire courtroom in a suspended breath. Derek Collins rose slowly from his seat, the polished surface of the table catching the light as he adjusted his stance, each movement deliberate, measured, and imbued with a quiet authority that drew every eye in the room. Matthew's expression faltered slightly, the confident smirk he had worn now dimmed, a faint tightening of the lips betraying the first real recognition that the man before him carried influence far beyond what he had assumed. The spectators leaned forward subtly, as if drawn by the gravity of calm, each person sensing the shift in energy, the silent signal that something profound was about to unfold. Derek's eyes scanned the room once more, briefly meeting those of the jurors, the officers, and the gallery, each glance calculated to command attention and underscore presence without the need for overt declaration. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows highlighted the contours of the room, the polished wood gleaming, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor, echoing the slow, deliberate rhythm of Derek's movements. Matthews shifted in place, an almost imperceptible step back, his posture betraying growing awareness and a subtle dissonance between perception and reality, the balance of authority beginning to tip as the quiet command of presence overtook assumptions of position. Derek reached into his briefcase with a calm, fluid motion, removing a slim identification card and holding it before him with steady hands, the light catching the embossed seal, reflecting a brilliance that drew the attention of the entire courtroom. The gallery remained still, the soft murmur of movement ceasing entirely as all eyes fell on the emblem, a symbol of rank, experience, and recognition that quietly demanded acknowledgement. Matthew's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, a breath caught as the realization registered, the room's atmosphere shifting instantly as the air seemed to carry a collective intake of comprehension and surprise. Derek's calm demeanor never wavered, the subtle authority in his posture and gaze underscoring the significance of the reveal without a single raised voice, the tension now suspended in silent acknowledgement across every face present. The judge's hand hovered lightly over the gavel, a gentle reminder of the procedural flow, yet even the authority of the bench seemed to defer to the quiet dominance Derek had projected, the balance of expectation realigning as recognition spread through the officers, jurors, and spectators alike. The soft click of the briefcase closing punctuated the stillness, a measured conclusion to the moment of reveal, the weight of presence lingering in the air as if the room itself absorbed and held the shift in authority. Matthews looked around, searching for some anchor, a confirmation from fellow officers, but the subtle acknowledgement of Derek's position echoed in the collective awareness of the courtroom, leaving him momentarily adrift, his assumptions challenged, his perception of control quietly dismantled. The sunlight continued its slow crawl across the floors and faces, illuminating the subtle expressions of realization and shifting posture, each observer now acutely aware of the presence and influence exerted by the man standing calmly before them, every movement and breath measured, deliberate, and commanding without the need for any loud assertion. The silent power of recognition now reigning over the room in a way that left every individual conscious of the true weight of authority and the quiet inevitability of respect. The courtroom remained suspended in a delicate, quiet tension as Derek Collins allowed the weight of the moment to settle fully over everyone present. His posture remained composed, shoulders squared, hands lightly resting on the polished surface in front of him, fingers tracing the edge in a subtle, controlled rhythm. The gallery leaned in almost imperceptibly, jurors adjusting in their seats, officers shifting their weight slightly, each person aware that the dynamics of authority had shifted without any overt announcement. Matthew's expression reflected a dawning awareness, the confident smirk replaced by a quiet, restrained acknowledgement that the man before him carried a presence and command that surpassed assumptions and expectations, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the room pivoting subtly toward recognition of true authority. Derek's gaze swept slowly across the spectators, the subtle light from the tall windows catching the polished wood and the attentive faces, highlighting the nuanced expressions of realization, of curiosity, and of subtle admiration, each detail noted in the quiet, calculated assessment that had guided him throughout the morning. The judge's hands hovered lightly over the gavel, the faint reflection of sunlight on its surface emphasizing the calm deliberation that defined the moment, while Derek's deliberate, measured movements projected an unspoken rhythm that aligned the attention of the entire courtroom without raising a single voice. Matthew's posture reflected the first tangible signs of discomfort, a slight tightening of the hands on the edge of the stand, a measured inhale, an almost imperceptible hesitation in movement, the subtle acknowledgement that his assumptions about the flow of control were quietly, irrevocably, being recalibrated by the presence before him. Derek allowed a small, deliberate shift in stance, a measured glance toward the jury, a calm but pointed motion that conveyed attentiveness and silent authority simultaneously, commanding the room without overt action. The gallery seemed drawn into a collective awareness, each observer absorbing the subtle signals of poise, preparation, and quiet mastery that Derek projected, the stillness itself becoming a conduit for understanding, the tension in the room amplifying with anticipation as every detail, every breath, every flicker of attention contributed to the growing realization that influence and respect were earned through presence, through the deliberate command of perception rather than force or loud assertion. Sunlight continued its slow, deliberate crawl across the polished floor, tracing the line from Derek's calm figure to the subtle adjustments of the jurors, officers, and spectators, highlighting the shared acknowledgement of a shift in authority that was unfolding with precision, quiet yet undeniable. Matthew's eyes darted briefly to other officers, seeking confirmation, reassurance, or some indication that his perception could still hold dominance. But he found only mirrored uncertainty, a shared, silent recognition of Derek's poised presence. Each observer felt the room subtly realigning around this calm, measured authority, every motion, every glance, every quiet pause magnifying the perception of influence Derek maintained with steady, unwavering confidence. The faint hum of the lighting, the soft shuffle of papers, the occasional creak of floorboards all blended into the rhythm of the courtroom, now orchestrated around a presence that commanded attention without a single raised word, a deliberate, understated assertion of authority that left the room suspended in quiet acknowledgement, every individual acutely aware that respect and recognition were now being quietly, yet irrevocably, enforced by the measured composure of the man at the center. The courtroom remained suspended in a quiet, almost reverent stillness as Derek Collins allowed the final moments to unfold, each breath measured, each movement deliberate, a silent conductor orchestrating the attention of every person present. Matthew's posture reflected a subtle surrender, the weight of realization settling in as he took in the composed authority radiating from Derek, understanding that the assumptions he had carried into the room were no longer sufficient to anchor his perception of control. Derek's gaze moved slowly, scanning the room once more, acknowledging the subtle expressions of comprehension, curiosity, and muted respect that now spread across the jurors, officers, and spectators alike. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast shifting patterns on the polished floor, illuminating faces, gestures, and the contours of the courtroom, highlighting the unspoken acknowledgement of Derek's presence and the quiet assertion of his authority that needed no words to command recognition. Each individual seemed to lean subtly into the rhythm of the room, the faint sounds of papers shuffling, the soft scrape of chairs, and the distant hum of lighting blending into a quiet, deliberate cadence that Derek had established through calm presence alone. Matthews glanced briefly at the other officers, seeking reassurance or some indication of support, but found only subtle, shared acknowledgement of Derek's poised authority, the room collectively absorbing the realization that the balance of respect had shifted, that influence was now defined by measured presence rather than assumed position. Derek allowed a slow, deliberate adjustment of his posture, a slight, calm blink, an unspoken, controlled signal that reinforced the quiet power he carried. The courtroom responding in near silent recognition, each person subconsciously attuned to the shift in dynamics. The judge's hand hovered gently over the gavel, the polished wood catching the light, an unspoken acknowledgement of the moment, while Derek's calm, steady composure framed the room's awareness, the subtle energy rippling outward and touching every observer with the undeniable weight of competence and authority. Matthew's eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, the first acknowledgement that the narrative of dominance he had assumed was quietly being rewritten, the subtle tension in his shoulders and hands reflecting a measured surrender to the reality now apparent to everyone present. Derek's measured breathing continued, harmonizing with the soft rhythms of the room, each inhale and exhale reinforcing the quiet dominance of controlled presence, every subtle movement, every shift of attention, every micro-expression of recognition building into a collective understanding that authority could be wielded without force, that respect and acknowledgement could be claimed through measured confidence, deliberate calm, and an unwavering grasp of the room's attention. The sunlight continued its slow crawl across the room, highlighting attentive postures, subtle glances, and the gentle rise and fall of collective anticipation, each observer now fully conscious of the unspoken lesson imparted by Derek's presence. That true authority is quiet, deliberate, and undeniable, recognized not through volume or aggression, but through calm mastery of self, environment, and perception, leaving every individual in the room profoundly aware of the balance of influence that had quietly shifted, and the enduring impression of power measured in composure, preparation, and unspoken command.